All right, I think it's 9:05. It's time to get started. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the session, Oh, Say Can You See? A U.S. Digital Identity Strategy. For those who raced out of bed to get here early because they wanted to hear, what was happening here, can you see a digital identity strategy? The answer is sadly no. I'll just give you the Cliff Notes version. So, if you were out late at the club last night and you're like, I'm at the club, I'm in Vegas, this is good. No, I got to get to bed. I got to be responsible. I really want to hear all, no, I don't have any great news here, but I'll give you some thoughts, I think, in terms of why we are at the spot that we're at and maybe, some thoughts on what a U.S. strategy could look like. And actually, there's some glimmers of hope that are out there in terms of things that are starting to happen in Congress and the executive branch. I'm Jeremy Grant. I'm a managing director in Venable's Technology and Innovation Group. I also serve as the head of a nonprofit called the Better Identity Coalition, which has brought together a lot of companies, both buyers and some vendors in the space, to focus on what I would call the policy layer of digital identity. So I'll give you some thoughts and perspectives and sort of where we're at, and maybe we'll be able to say something better than no next year. Anyways, I want to kind of start with a journey across the globe in terms of what's looking, what we're seeing with different countries that I would say are peers of the U.S. or ones we often benchmark ourselves to. So in Europe, there's a big initiative in the European Union, really led by the highest levels of government to create a digital identity wallet for all Europeans. Pretty forward-looking. We can talk about whether it's a little too forward-looking, but really interesting and ambitious. They're definitely thinking about this strategically. Over in the UK, no longer part of the EU, they're also thinking about things. They've been moving forward with their digital identity and attributes trust framework, focusing on how to open up different government sources that are authoritative sources for identity for use not just by government but the private sector. You go over to Singapore, for a few years they've had SingPass, a pretty robust national digital identity system. Up in Canada, DIAC's been doing great work. They've launched their Voila Verified Trustmark program. New Zealand doing some good things these days with Digital Identity Services Trust Framework Bill. Basically, everywhere that you look around the world, you're seeing policymakers, leaders start to think about digital identity from a very strategic perspective. But in the US, the last time we had a formal digital identity strategy was 2011. And I think a lot of you know I ran that program. It was called the National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace. To be clear, I'm not here to whine today that we don't have that strategy now or we should bring it back. I actually think it served a purpose then, and some things have changed since then. I don't know that's necessarily the model we should follow going forward, but it's a long time. If you think digital identity is important, which you guys are all at Identiverse, so, right, you got that set. Long time not to be thinking about this. And to be clear, that doesn't mean that nothing's going on in the government. There's a lot of pockets of activity, and in fact, a lot of the folks who are driving this in the U.S. government are here right now. So, TSA, we heard about earlier this week, is doing awesome work to drive mobile driver's licenses right now for in-person use cases, primarily TSA checkpoints, because it's the TSA who's leading this, but it could also work for something like buying booze. NIST and DHS are collaborating on a new project to help states with standards and best practices for remote identity proofing use cases for mobile driver's licenses. The White House has been working for some time in an executive order focused on reducing identity theft just in government benefits, but nothing to actually protect Americans from identity theft threats in any other sector. White House and the General Services Administration are also trying to expand the login.gov system for citizen services, again, a small subset of where we need digital identity. And as you might have heard from Amy, if you were here earlier, the Social Security Administration has a tool called ECBSV, the Electronic Consent-Based Social Security Number Verification System. We love our acronyms in DC. That does a really cool thing. It'll validate when you're applying for credit, is there really a Jeremy Grant with this date of birth and SSN who's not dead that matches what's in the SSA's database, which is kind of awesome because synthetic identity fraud has been the fastest growing type of financial crime the last few years, and a lot of it depends on the ability to, or stopping it depends on the ability to actually hit the source of truth. Do people really exist? But that only works for credit transactions, not for government services or other places you might need to prove who you are online. And there's a new Senate bill that was just introduced by Senators Cotton and Schatz about a month ago that would call for the Commerce Department to create a brand new national digital identity verification system solely for verifying age to access social media. So certainly things happening, but what really ties it together? There's no efforts to coordinate activities across the US government. And from my perspective, that has a few impacts. One, we have no systems whatsoever to address some problems where we need better identity. or reliance on inefficient legacy tools in places, where we should be thinking maybe more forward. In other cases, we're seeing duplicative systems to address other problems that are out there, which then ends up putting Americans through multiple redundant processes rather than being able to use something that might be a little simpler from a user experience perspective. Basically, we've got no strategy to look at cross-cutting multi-sectoral challenges where we actually might need to be thinking strategically about identity. And it seems like every time we need something to solve an identity challenge, and these problems keep popping up more and more each year, the focus is like on that Senate bill. Let's build a new one-off system, rather than think a little bit about whether we could solve some of these problems if we had common digital identity infrastructure. And to be clear, digital identity is critical infrastructure. DHS in 2019 declared identity one of 55 national critical functions, which they defined as the functions of government and the private sector so vital to the U.S. that their disruption, corruption, or dysfunction would have a debilitating impact on either the nation's homeland security, economic security, public health or safety, or any combination of these. And seeing identity on this was like kind of a holy crap moment, because a lot of them are things like process wastewater, transport cargo and passengers by rail, distribute electricity. There's all sorts of things that you think of, and then they listed provide identity management and associated trust support services. But this is not actually translated to any actions or funding that would prioritize identity. In fact, I go as far to say that identity is the only one of these 55 national critical functions where we don't have any strategy or plan. Everything else has got policy, funding, actions behind it to try to actually focus on making sure that you don't have failures, among other things, as the definition would say. So here's what this means practically for Americans. So you need to drive or get a state ID. Well, you stand in line at the DMV for a while and you prove who you are and hopefully you succeed. And you get a plastic card out of that. If you're applying for a credit card online, the Social Security Administration will validate for your bank whether your name, date of birth, and SSN match, but there isn't any other government agency that will validate identity data for new credit applications outside of some DMVs through AMVA's DLDV system, but it's not available in all the states, which makes it kind of not useful, unfortunately, for companies trying to operate nationwide. Need to apply for government benefit? Well, the current thinking is we will have you duplicate more or less the crappy experience you went through at the DMV to get your driver's license, but this time you'll do it online through a digital system. And, oh, by the way, SSA won't validate the data, so now we're seeing surging synthetic identity fraud in government benefits. SSA has said they will find a way to do so, though it's not actually clear whether they're going to leverage that ECBSV infrastructure or build something new. Need to prove you're 18 to go on Instagram or view adult materials. So age verification, this is sort of like the new frontier the last year. So I mentioned the Commerce Bill, the Senate bill, which would basically say the Commerce Department is going to build a new age verification system just for this. Meanwhile, we're seeing interesting things happening in the states where bills are pushing forward. So Louisiana is one example. They have an age verification bill for porn, but they've got a mobile driver's license app, the My LA Wallet. And Louisiana wants to make sure that you have a path to access your spicy materials. So they have the only way to get to Pornhub right now in Louisiana is to do age verification tied to the state government app, which just blows my mind. Utah, on the other hand, also has a mobile driver's license, but they're less focused on making sure there's an easy path for their residents to access these materials. And so there's no way to do age verification. And I think I read somewhere that downloads of VPNs in the state of Utah are up like 850% the last 3 months, because Pornhub's currently blocked if it shows that you're coming from Utah. Here we are. Oh, and if you're going through a TSA checkpoint, well, now you can do something kind of cool. You can use your mobile driver's license app that a few states are rolling out at several airports, but you can't actually use that mobile driver's license for any other use case on the slide or anything else you're trying to do where you need to prove identity. So at a time when we have no strategy, this is actually a really bad time not to have a strategy. We're seeing identity-related cybercrime soaring to record levels, impacting millions of Americans. A study from a couple years ago shows about half of consumers have now been impacted. Year after year, we see these headlines that identity scams sort of make 2021 a record year. You can say that for 2022 and 2023. Things aren't getting better. I mean, you guys are all identiverse. These are how the bad guys go after our money and our data, is they look to compromise identity, because it's not that hard, because the infrastructure is not there. And this doesn't just impact government programs, but banking, health, retail, and other sectors. So this gentleman here is a guy named Jimmy Kirby, who is the Deputy Director of FinCEN, the Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. This was from a speech he gave at the Fed ID Forum last September, where he said, we're doing an analysis. So banks file these things called SARs, suspicious activity reports, when they see suspicious activity that somebody might be trying to commit a financial crime. And he said, we're looking at them, and the vast majority of them, they haven't provided a number yet, but I'm hearing they think it's very, very high, are tied to some sort of a potential breakdown in the identity verification process. So not shockingly, most financial crime is tied to challenges in identity. We're also seeing privacy and equity concerns around identity getting a lot more complex. So I think, last year, most people are pretty familiar with the issues that the IRS ran into when they wanted to start using selfie match as a way to verify identity online. This was a way you could prove who you are, so then you could do services with the IRS that you might not be able to do otherwise online because the risk model is such that they kind of need to know who you are. But the use of face biometrics and a selfie match became an issue. And in the meantime, the White House has been doing some work on biometrics. MITRE, who is a federally funded think tank basically for the federal government, is quoted in an article basically saying here that the White House definition of biometrics actually requires a rethink because they're focusing on these issues have become very complex and lots of questions around bias and equity, some good ones, some things also, from my perspective, being blown out of proportion, or people focusing maybe on problems we had a few years ago, but not necessarily where the technology is going and where there might be risks here. And as we heard from Andre earlier this week, Andre Durand, who, if you saw his keynote, the rise of AI has a lot of people worrying about how are we going to know who's human? So we're all just going to be living in, virtual Blade Runner, where, we're answering a bunch of random questions and hoping somebody doesn't jump through the screen and blow our head off. And my favorite or least favorite thing, so WorldCoin, I think some of you might have heard about this, raised $110 million last week. This is Sam Altman's side project who runs OpenAI. It is truly remarkable in that it combines two things I really hate into one: central match biometrics and a shitcoin. So, the idea is nobody's going to know who's human with AI. Okay, I get that. We've got a problem. We said this 30 years ago as well with the internet. Nobody knows your dog on the internet. It's a problem too, but the idea is we're going to have these proprietary orbs in central locations, and you will go and register your iris. They take great pains to point out, well, it's just a template, it's not the image. And then we'll use that to facilitate giving you a new currency. And the basic take seems to be, and this is where it falls apart for me a little bit, when AI has taken all of our jobs, we will need a way to distribute universal basic income to people, and that will be WorldCoin tied to this is, I don't know. They raised $110 million. So there are people who think this makes sense. And I've talked to them a couple times, and I'm like, but the iris orb, like that's not going to be on my computer. Oh no, that we can't miniaturize that. I'm like, then why are you using iris? Anyways, AI is going to cause some challenges. AI means we should be thinking more than ever strategically about digital identity and how we're going to know who is human online and what authenticity is going to mean in this new era that we're heading into. So from a regulatory standpoint, I've been asking the question, is identity the new salmon? So, what are you talking about, fish? So Barack Obama in a State of the Union in 2011 was going on a little bit of a riff, talking about how we're sometimes a little inefficient in Washington in the way we regulate things. And he was talking about salmon, who, as you may know, sometimes are in freshwater and sometimes in saltwater. And he noticed, well, look, when they're in freshwater, the Interior Department is in charge of regulating salmon. But then when they get out to saltwater, it's the Commerce Department, NOAA, the National, Oceans, anyways, the Fisheries Group that's over in the Commerce Department. I used to work around the corner from them there. And he goes, and of course I hear it gets more complicated once they're smoked. But this is sort of what we're seeing with identity, where let's look at attribute validation services like what SSA runs with ECBSV, where you can access, with consent, if you're trying to apply for new credit, to prove who you are, but not for a background check, not for government services. We basically are standing up these little things that are very single-purpose built, bifurcated, but there isn't actually any, what I would call common use infrastructure or common policy thinking or common regulatory approach around how we actually drive these services. So a few things that are in the works. I mentioned before the White House has been working on an identity theft executive order. This was from a highlight from the summary of the State of the Union in March 1st, 2022, which today's what, June 1st, June 2nd, so we're now a year and 3 months. It still has not been released. I guess I could have crossed off May, now it's June here. So it said in the coming weeks they were going to put something out. It does not exist yet. And, the one thing that we've seen in terms of what's in it is a copy was leaked to Natalie Alms, who works for Federal Computer Week, has been doing awesome reporting in the digital identity space the last couple of years. And a lot of it is basically focused on, well, we're going to solve digital identity by making the login.gov system that they've been trying for years to figure out identity proofing for. It's really more of a, I'd call it like a poor man's Okta. It's a SIAM system that does single sign-on account management, MFA. Actually, one of the first implement FIDO2, did a nice job there. But we're going to use this for identity proofing, that, we'll have an agency build this for everybody. And, no concerns there. So, those who missed the news, there was an Inspector General report a couple months ago that said that GSA was misleading customers on login's ability to actually comply with NIST identity standards and charging them for services that they were not actually providing. Anyways, I said this on loop. Anyways, let's move on. My point is, this might not be the best way to approach all of this. Now, there is a glimmer of hope. So in March, the Biden administration released their national cybersecurity strategy, and strategic objective 4.5 was support development of a digital identity ecosystem. And how we're doing on time. I don't know if I want to read the whole thing, but it's worth looking at. And it talks about, I think, a lot of the issues I'm actually talking about, that the lack of good identity solutions allows fraud to flourish, perpetrates exclusion and equity, adds a lot of inefficiency to our financial activities and daily lives, talks about how identity theft's on the rise, lots of victims, and it notes, operating independently, neither the private nor public sectors have been able to solve this problem. And then talks about starting to enable and encourage investments in strong, verifiable digital identity solutions. Again, I don't want to read everything. This was good language. Although, there was one sentence in there that I'm still trying to figure out, which is when it came to mobile driver's licenses, they said, acknowledging that states are piloting MDLs, we note and encourage a focus on privacy, security, civil liberties, equity, accessibility, interoperability, all the things we want to see, which is a weird line. It says we acknowledge that some stuff's happening in the states. We're not saying if it's good or bad or promising or not. We're just saying that's happening. And it seems like they're suggesting these things are concerns, but they're not actually saying anybody should do anything about it, though I actually think the people who are working on MDL, some of them in this room, are very focused on this right now. Strange language. There's some concern that, again, maybe they're not focusing on this strategically. So I think what's really important next here to watch, and maybe next year when we say, can you see a U.S. digital identity strategy, the answer will be yes, is the implementation plan. Because this is just a high-level strategy, and the White House Office of the National Cyber Director said, look, what really is going to matter is the implementation plan for all of this. So that's where I think we'll learn more about action, hopefully later this year. So here's what I think they should do. I think it's time to think about a distinctly American approach for identity. We talk about, so many conversations, sort of start and end with, have you seen what the Estonians have done? And my point is, yeah, that's a really awesome smart card in a country with a population that's smaller than Fairfax County, Virginia, and actually a lot less diverse. It's not necessarily the model. So we don't need a national ID. We don't need to build identity systems, which starts to touch this political third rail that gets a lot of people really concerned. Instead, let's start to focus on what I call the identity gap, which is the fact that we have a number of nationally recognized authoritative identity systems, be it the driver's license, the birth certificate, passport. Social Security is not really a credentialing system. It's an identifier, but it's still valuable. I got a global entry card. That's not my picture. Every one of them is trapped in the paper world and has been for a long time. And yet what we need more than ever now are digital solutions where we can take these systems and actually be able to assert them online the same way we can if I'm walking into a building. Getting a meat and cheese platter at Italy last night. They wanted to, charge it to my room. How do I know you're Jeremy Grant? Apparently the name tag I had wasn't good enough, so I showed them my driver's license. But these things don't really work online. So how do we start to close that gap? In simple terms, our approach should be, I mentioned this before, if I've already gone through the process of having an agency vet my identity once, I waited in line at the DMV. It was bad, but then I got a plastic card out of it that was good. Well, that works in the physical world. Why can't I also ask that agency to vouch for me when I need to prove who I am to another party? This seems like it'd be a nice service to provide citizens. So we should start focusing on looking at our paper-based systems and modernizing them around a privacy-protecting, consumer-centric model that would allow anybody to ask the government agency that issued a credential to stand behind it in the online world by validating the information from the credential. Distinctly American approach. So how could we get there? Well, there's basically two ways. Had to get some Elvis in because it's Vegas. One, the White House could just decide to launch a digital identity initiative following through on the national cybersecurity strategy. Or two, Congress could pass a law that says the federal government should do something. So we talked about one, and we'll see if we get there. There has been some progress on the second. So the Improving Digital Identity Act is actually legislation we helped develop in the Better Identity Coalition, along with a bipartisan group of members of Congress in both the House and Senate. You can see here it actually passed the Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee on March 29th. We've been working with Senator Sinema from Arizona and Senator Cynthia Lummis from Wyoming on this. They've been awesome to work with. On the House side, this bill actually started there. Bill Foster, who's an Illinois Democrat that actually did a keynote at Identiverse in D.C. a few years ago, has really been passionate about this. He has not reintroduced the bill this year because he's a Democrat in a House that's controlled by Republicans, and his take's been, let's talk to some Republicans and see how they want to approach this. They're probably not going to take up my bill, but it was a bipartisan bill. I got an asterisk by John Katko and Jim Langevin, who were on the bill last year, but both have retired from Congress. So I would say there's still good support in the House, good bipartisan interest, but questions around how do you structure it, what committee's jurisdiction. But we got a bill that moved through the Senate at least that's got, potentially a path forward. And there's really three pillars to better identity that are in this original bill. So the first is calling for a whole of government approach that would bring together federal, state, and local authoritative issuers. The idea being, if we're not building a national ID system, and I don't think anybody wants to do that, while our authoritative systems are split between the federal, state, and local levels. So how can you get all of those groups together, hopefully convened by something run by the White House, to give everybody sort of a time box period to figure out how are we going to do this? What are the policies that are there? Do we need to change policies? What are the funding methods? What are the standards? With that, NIST really plays an important role in terms of setting a framework of standards and policies and rules. Think of it as a playbook or a framework that any agency at any level of government can use to create interoperable services for identity validation, MDocs, attribute validation services that sets a high bar for security and privacy. Because there's a whole bunch of ways we could do this in a way that's really bad for security and privacy, so let's not do that, and nobody's better than the folks at NIST in terms of figuring that out. And then the third would be a pool of grant dollars to the states to help modernize their legacy ID systems to support digital ID, with the caveat that you only get the money if you follow the NIST stuff, because we don't want to be funding things in states that don't set a high bar for security and privacy and also aren't interoperable. And that a lot of you who work for big national companies with a footprint, if you want to integrate, say, with 50 state mobile driver's licenses, you don't want to have to do 50 different integrations. You want to see this all be standards-based. So the nice thing that happened, this was the original Improving Digital Identity Act, is that middle part actually got peeled off and included in a big piece of legislation called the Chips and Science Act that passed in the summertime of last year. There was a big reauthorization of NIST in there. Congressman Foster, who sits in the House Science Committee, basically took the essence of the NIST portion of his bill and put it into the NIST reauthorization of the work they're doing on digital identity. And some of the folks who are sitting in the back of the room here are now working on some of this guidance. So we got a little bit of a head start here. These other two things, I think we still have a lot of work to go. So with that, I wanted to say thank you. And if we've got a little bit of time for questions, I think we got like 3 minutes. I'm happy to take them. Next. Yes, sir.
Where do you see the role of local government services and, from not, local government is more consumption of identity than doesn't tend to be a producer of identity, but they tend to have much more interaction, especially with marginalized populations. Where do you see that all?
So I think from the issuer standpoint, a lot of local governments issue birth certificates and marriage certificates. Some cases it's state level, some cases it's local. And so I think from the issuer standpoint, that's the most important thing. The next part of that question, in terms of how they actually interact with people, is a little bit more complicated. I would say, one, they need to, look, every level of government needs this. We get a lot of questions from, federal agencies, state agencies, what should we be thinking about in identity, because they need their own solutions to figure out who's who for digital services. The local side, a lot of it tends to be more in person. Issues in a lot of jurisdictions, both state and local, where some people just can't get a physical ID. This is a massive problem that here we're talking about this leap to digital, but there's a lot of people who, for whatever reason, they're poor, they've been in and out of homelessness, maybe you got evicted a month ago and that cardboard box that had your social security card and birth certificate washed away in the rain, they can't get a physical credential. So there's actually a portion of the original Foster bill that in the grants to states would require states to set aside 10% of those dollars for what we call identity inclusion efforts to try and help people who can't get a basic credential these days. I don't think that funding is going to happen given current politics, but it's at least been a portion of things. Other questions? All right. Well, thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.